Um, so we'll be talking about sagebrush management here in Utah. I'll just jump right in here. Let me. So I first want to talk about professional or educational bias, and I think it's important with a topic like this. And what I mean by that is when we look at this landscape as an example, and what values we see in that landscape matters based on our professional educational biases. So I'm a trained wildlife biologist. When I look at this landscape here, I see habitat, I see cover, I see food resources, I see differing habitat types as you move up in elevation, and those kind of things. So as a wildlife biologist, that may be what I see. However, I've worked with lots of, like, for example, range ecologists who would look at this landscape and they would see forage, pounds per acre on this landscape. They would see watering sites for livestock. They might see, various vegetation community types. They wouldn't call it habitat, but they would look at the different vegetation communities there and try to define them and what are the processes going on. So my point is that this landscape has all of that. It has all the values of the wildlife ecologist, the range ecologist, and more. And so understanding where we're coming from, I think, can help us as we think about how manipulations of these systems happen, why they happen, and our values around that. So I just think it's important that we try to check those biases at the door the best we can when we start to consider these things. When it comes to sagebrush, there's also this Western cultural bias that we have with sagebrush, and we have to think about the people who first came out here and how they viewed the landscape, because those values and ideas are still running through our Western culture, and especially in our more rural communities that are living in these areas and managing these areas. That's going on. Now, I'm not trying to be too critical here. My own progenitors did this very thing. They walked across the plains and came to Utah and other parts of the West. So I very much understand that. But I think about where these people came from. If we look at a world map, most of the people who came, at least to the Utah area, came from the British Isles or Scandinavia. And they came first to the eastern United States. And so what was their value of land when they were coming? And here's a couple of pictures. The top right is some pastures in England. And then the bottom left is some tall grass prairie in Illinois. And so these would be how the people who came west viewed the landscape. Very, very different ecosystems going on here. But that doesn't mean that the people understood why those ecosystems were so different than what they experienced here. And when they got here, this is what they found. Poor people, right? Like here they are coming from these places with pounds per acre, well over 2,000 pounds per acre of forage, that kind of thing, and they're coming out here with often much less than that. But what's happened is often, because of these values and the history of all this, there's been a attempt to convert sagebrush into more straight grasslands, and especially since the post-World War II era, I'll call it the red meat, board feet, God bless America movement, which was understandable given the times. But there's some data out there that shows that pretty much anywhere a tractor could go in sagebrush systems, sagebrush got treated, which had varying levels of effects on these systems and what's going on. So when when I visit with our local folks here in Utah, often that's through the local working groups and that kind of thing. This idea, this bias against sagebrush and towards grass is still very prevalent out there, and we're still dealing with it. So from there, let's jump into sagebrush systems, how they work, and give a little bit of background. And the first thing I want to talk about is we often just use one term, sagebrush, as this overarching idea of what these systems are like. But there's actually lots of nuance and heterogeneity going on within these systems. Here in Utah, it's basically Wyoming sagebrush, basin sagebrush, basin big, and mountain big. So these are three subspecies of the same big sagebrush species. And basically they're on an elevation gradient. There's some exceptions to that, but at our lowest elevations, we are dealing with Wyoming big sagebrush. At our mid elevation, we're dealing with basin. There's some people who like the term Bonneville for some of the areas, but I'll just call it basin big sage. And then our mountain big sage when we start to reach the tree line, basically where our forests start. So the differences here primarily come from precipitation differences. So in our Wyoming sites, we're dealing with an annual precip of 8 to 12 inches. When we move into our basin, we're 8 to 16 inches. And when we get up into our mountain, we're over 14 inches of precip. So this precipitation really drives how these different communities respond to disturbance. And so it's really interesting. But here's just kind of a little graphic to show this relationship between elevation and moisture precipitation with these different systems. So there's two other sagebrush communities that probably ought to be discussed when talking about Utah, and that's black sagebrush, Artemisia nova, or low sagebrush, which is Artemisia arbuscula. So these are dwarf sagebrush. They're very small. This is largely due to soil. Shallower soils is where these communities exist. And but here in Utah, we do have some larger landscapes. For example, with Artemisia nova, with black sage, most of the Parker Plateau is black sagebrush. So all of these have various levels of ability to respond to disturbance. Our shallower soil types with our dwarf sagebrushes have very little ability to deal with disturbance. They have very low resistance resilience. I'll come back to the resistance resilience term here in a minute. So one way to look at this is through fire return intervals across our western landscapes. And so when we start down in that really low elevation salt desert areas, we're having natural fire return intervals of greater than 500 years. When we get up to these low sage areas, a fire return interval of 100 to 200 years. When we're in Wyoming big sage, we're 30 to 100 years. And when we get into mountain big sage, we're 10 to 25 or 12 to 15. And basically that's lower mountain big sage and higher elevation mountain big sage. So when we're dealing with this kind of, these communities evolved with this kind of natural disturbance, their ability then to respond, or the probability of success of our artificially induced disturbance, changes across those different systems. And that's important to understand when we talk about the influences of sagebrush management or manipulation on wildlife or livestock. Another issue that's going on here, and has been going on for a while now in the West, is we've completely inversed this fire return interval, the frequency that's going on. And this is primarily due to cheatgrass invasion on the low end. So in these lower elevation salt desert, juniper, sagebrush systems, we have cheatgrass coming in. It has, it's very fine fuel, has fire very easily carries in it, and has fire return intervals of 5 to 7 years or so. When a system has evolved on 100 to 200 year fire return interval, it just can't sustain itself with that kind of, with the influence of cheatgrass there. On the upper end, we deal with fire suppression, the Smoky Bear policies, and now we have very little fire that's happened over the last 100 years in those upper elevation communities. This all kind of leads us to this idea of resistance resilience that I talked about earlier. I really like this idea because it's a very concise way of viewing this very complex system within sagebrush communities here in the West. And what it's saying is it's resilience to disturbance or invasion by exotics, or it's the resistance to it or the resilience of it. So resistance to that disturbance happening in the first place, but if it does happen, then the resiliency factor. So when we're at lower temperatures, lower and lower precip, we're in this salt desert, Wyoming and areas, we have a much lower resistance resilience value. And as we move up in elevation, we end up with these much higher resistant resilient values. And so what this can do is help us predict what our goals are for any type of project. So if our goal is to increase the amount of forage or grasses and forbs, the probability of that happening increases as those resilience values go up. And the lower they get, the lower probability of success. So those are very important things to consider when we think about how to manage sagebrush here in Utah and across the West. I also wanted to mention the importance of perennial grasses. I often have asked people, what do you think is the keystone or the foundation of sagebrush systems? And most often their response is it's got to be sagebrush. And that's a kind of an intuitive answer, but what I think is more important to understand is if we lose sagebrush, but we keep our perennial grasses, the probability of that community getting sagebrush back and maintaining itself is fairly high. But if we keep our sagebrush and we lose our perennial grasses, which is happening where these cheatgrass stands are taking over, or where we've had improper grazing or drought or some other factor, once we lose those perennial grasses, if we get fire and lose that sagebrush, the probability of getting that community back is very, very low. And so as we look at these systems, I think we need to put our eye more on these perennial grasses as the keystone, and how these systems would persist in the future. So let's jump now into the sage-grouse life cycle and try to explain their dependence on these sagebrush systems, because the sage-grouse issue is really what's driving sagebrush management right now across the West, and especially here in Utah. For example, when we were leading up to the 2015 Endangered Species Act decision on sage-grouse, the governor of Utah put out an executive order, and in that was basically a moratorium on sagebrush treatment in the state of Utah. And so this sage-grouse issue is really driving things. The problem with it is it's a little more nuanced than just, this is a sagebrush obligate species, therefore if we take out sagebrush, we're going to hurt the species. It's just not quite that simple. And luckily here at USU, we have some of the only data in the West in the last 20 years that can help us through this kind of nuance. But so moving into the sage-grouse life cycle, here's a male sage-grouse in breeding display. So they move to what we call leks, which are just dancing grounds where the males gather, females come in and make their mate selection. Lots of interesting behavioral biology going on there. But usually what's happening is these males are finding dancing grounds, which are usually areas that have lower cover where the males can be seen and heard. But they're locating these dancing grounds in the best, nesting habitat around, which is the highest probability of having females, right? So that's kind of the order of context for where we find leks. But this is the breeding time. Females come in, make their choice, and then they head off to nest. So here's a female sage-grouse. If you look close under that sagebrush, you can actually see her there. She's incubating. And what we found, now there's exceptions to this. We find some anomalies out there, but by and large, most sage-grouse nests are under sagebrush, and the most successful nests are in sagebrush. And usually that's fairly heavy sagebrush cover. So the minimum might be about 10% sagebrush cover, but the best is probably 15 to 25 or 30% sagebrush cover. So large areas of good thick sagebrush cover is what's needed for sage-grouse to successfully nest. And that scale becomes a real issue, and the seasonality of habitat becomes an issue when we start to talk about sagebrush treatments. Nests lead to these little fuzz balls. Here, the chicks, when they're really young, kind of pre-flight, they're still kind of in that nesting habitat. But over time, as those chicks grow, the hens take them to more open habitats with higher amounts of grasses and forbs. So a chick sage-grouse has about 60 to 80% of its diet during those first 3 weeks. So this is leading up to flight, the ability to fly, is arthropods or insect matter. And it's the protein that they're getting from those insects that allow them to grow that fast. And so those insects are associated with higher forb abundance. And so that's why we see this transition. And this is the situation where we might see some benefit to sage-grouse through sagebrush manipulation, in that if we have areas of sagebrush that are so dense that they're limiting the amount of foreign grasses in the understory, then removing some of that sagebrush canopy could be beneficial to broods. So this is the one area where we might think about benefiting sage-grouse from. But then when we get back to winter, we get back into these situations that are very, the sage-grouse are very dependent on large areas of sagebrush that it's available above the snow. So in really heavy snow years, we need that tall sage out there. In more average years or low snowpack years, we found here in Utah, this is some research from Eric Thacker, found that the sage-grouse actually are choosing the black sage, which is an important component in nearly all of our populations of sage-grouse in Utah during the winter. What's also interesting is with wintering habitat, is you may have an area where sage-grouse winter 9 out of 10 years, they go to this one area, right? And that's kind of their wintering grounds. But then on that 10th year, you get that really high snowpack year, and that whole area gets covered. So now they have to go somewhere else to find that sagebrush cover above the snow. So sage-grouse diet during the winter is 100% sagebrush leaves. That's all they eat. And so they absolutely require that for food and cover. So what we found, like out in Rich County, we even found birds that normally wintered here. When that got covered with snow, they actually moved up in elevation where they had some big basin big sage sticking out above the snow. So they have to move to find that. So an area may only be used 1 in 10 years, but that area is critical to the persistence of that population. I think when I look at this whole sage-grouse issue, if there's one thing that I could get people to understand, it would be the scale at which the spatial scale at which sage-grouse require for those populations to persist. Often they're looked at as a game bird, so they're compared to like a ruffed grouse or a pheasant or quail, and they're just so much, they need so much more space than that. If I looked at like how elk use a landscape, that's how sage-grouse use a landscape. And so I wanted to give you this example here. And this is probably, if we look across all of sage-grouse populations across the West, what I have encircled here is probably the best there is as far as densities and population persistence and low disturbance areas of sage-grouse. But I've been doing research up in this area for a few years now, and I can tell you that we know in this area from Pinedale down to almost out to Rawlins, kind of halfway between Rock Springs and Rawlins and Evanston, we have birds that move across that entire landscape, and they're all connected. Birds that winter in one area and they breed, 50 to 100 miles away. And granted, this is the extreme, but this is just an example of a landscape that's has high probability persistence of sage-grouse into the future. In Utah, we have much more naturally isolated sagebrush systems, so they're quite a bit smaller, but they still move and use incredible distances here in our state. So I just wanted to throw that out, and if I can get people to understand anything about sage-grouse, that scale is so important.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
So do they sort of stay in familial flocks? Am I using the right word for it? Or are they sort of, as they travel around that big landscape, is it sort of in some familial association? And then in the comments, we also have a question from Holly wanting to know if could we train the birds to biocontrol sage?
So let me answer the first one. They really only stay in familial groups or during the brooding period, where they're associated with their natal mother. But even then, some of our research has shown brood mixing, where these chicks will actually leave their natal mother and go to another mother. And when they do that, their probability of survival actually goes up. So that there's a lot of mixing that goes on. And by the time they get to winter, it's a complete mix. We have male dispersal. So all your young males are just going all over tarnation. If there's any sort of genetic relationship, it would be with the females, where a hen raises chicks, nests in this area, raises chicks in this area. Her female chicks are likely going to be tied into that area and have some fidelity there. But even there, we find some pretty big movements with our younger females. So not a whole lot of sticking with the family going on. As far as biocontrol for sagebrush, with sage-grouse, they just don't consume enough to actually create a level of biocontrol. What we have done, and I won't go into it in too much depth, but we had a project down in southern Utah that used sheep, and we used supplement and kept the sheep in tight to these little like 10-acre areas, and we were able to have an effect on the sagebrush canopy cover that way, basically creating these resource pockets in this much broader landscape. And so that's the only biocontrol that I've know about or have dealt with. So thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. So I wanted to get into some of the research that we've done on how sage-grouse and livestock have responded to the sagebrush treatments that we've done. And this has primarily been in association with Dr. Messmer and Dr. Thacker here in Utah. So the first one would be down on Parker Mountain. So this is south central Utah. This is outlined in yellow is kind of what I'm going to refer to as the Parker Mountain or the plateau area. This is a high elevation, mostly black sage, sagebrush community. Although in the draws and as you move up in elevation, you start to get into mountain big sage areas as you get up near the aspen. And on the very south end, you actually get into some silver sage landscapes, but not too much of that. Mostly it's black sage and mountain big sage. Elevation goes from east to west. It climbs from about 7,000 feet to the rim, which is about almost 10,000 feet, and it extends approximately 30 miles north to south there. It has a mixture of land ownership that has gone on, and we've had the Parker Mountain Local Working Group down there, what we refer to as PARM, has been working in that area on the sage-grouse population. I think the first research started in 1998, and this is where I did my master's and PhD, was down in this area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sagebrush work that we did here. So we kind of have two experimental designs going on that I'm going to report. The little blue boxes, those are 100-acre plots, and they were positioned in this one pasture, and they were positioned to incorporate as much mountain big sagebrush as they could. So what the Parker Mountain Group decided was that they felt like the mountain big sagebrush in these areas was limiting the forb understory and grasses in the understory. And so could they manipulate the sagebrush in a way that would benefit the grouse and ultimately forage for the livestock in this area? So it was kind of a combo deal. So we started with these 16 plots, and we randomly assigned, so we had 4 replicates. We randomly assigned control where nothing happened. Dixie harrow, which is a mechanical harrow pulled behind a tractor, and it's a 2-way harrow, so it basically ripped the mountain big sagebrush out of and left bare dirt. I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. Then we also used a Lawson aerator, which is pulled behind it. It's another mechanical treatment, pulled behind a tractor, big drum filled with water with huge aeration teeth on it, and it just kind of tumbles across and crushes the sagebrush. The soils on the Parker are very rocky, and so what we ended up getting with the Lawson aerator was not at quite the treatment level that we were expecting. There were so many rocks and stuff, it precluded the aerator from getting all the sagebrush canopy down, but it actually left kind of a nice some alive, some dead situation. And then the third treatment was a spike or tebutyron, which is a chemical treatment. It was flown on in the fall. It was focused in on those mountain big sage communities in the plots that were assigned that, and then it took a full year to take effect. So we actually applied the spike a whole year prior to applying the mechanicals, because it takes that long to defoliate the sage. And the treatment type was randomly assigned to these plots. So that's kind of the first experiment. Once this was done, taking some of the results from that, we moved up into these higher elevation pastures here, and we went into much bigger areas, and we kind of have we don't have very good control, but we have a time series here. So starting on the very south end in the South Pasture, we went in 2006, and we just used spike or tebutyron, and we treated all of that green polygon there. In 2007, we moved in north into Nick's pasture, and all that tan polygon got treated with spike. Then we went into the Fourche Draw area in 2011 and treated with spike. And then in 2012, at the very north end, we treated in Chicken Springs pasture there in 2012. So we kind of have this gradient over time, so time since treatment. And then what we did is those yellow areas is we identified areas that were in these pastures but that did not get treated. so that we had some sort of reference to compare back to. So we conducted vegetation sampling. So in the going back to the square, the little blue square, the 100-acre plots, we did shrub canopy measurements. We did grass canopy and forb cover in those areas. We used pretty much the same techniques in the spike pastures and reference areas. Our original plan was to mark sage grouse at leks just down in elevation from these areas, and watch as the telemetry, the radio markers move through the pastures to see how they would use these areas, and hopefully using the telemetry to assess use. What we found in our first attempt on these 100-acre plots is all the females that we marked just either flew over or walked right through these areas and didn't spend any time there. And so if it was just based on the telemetry data, we would assume that we had no effect. But we knew that sage grouse were using these areas. It just by chance didn't happen to be the birds that we radio marked. So what I did was I used pellet counts. So we just walked transects and counted sage grouse pellets, and then we also did pointing dog surveys. So later in the brood period, when we knew the chicks would be safe from the dogs, we would run the dogs and flush the broods and get some counts. And so by that I could assess how the birds were using these areas. I did a very similar method in the upper elevation pastures using dogs. I did not do the pellet counts up there. And so most of this data that I'm going to share is coming out of Nate Dauphin's thesis. He was a master's student with Dr. Thacker, and then some of my own work for my master's. Lastly, one thing that Nate did was in these upper elevation pastures, he did a clip and weigh, so a biomass of forage in the treated areas and in the reference areas to start to look at difference, and then really that time since treatment difference over time. So what we found in those 100-acre plots was, so these first graphs are the shrub canopy differences. On the right, you can see the pictures. So on the top is a Dixie Harrow treatment. So that's the first year post-treatment. That's a two-way Dixie, and you can see the areas that got hit, and then we left islands and other areas of sagebrush in there for cover. So it wasn't a complete knockout. It was a treatment within a larger context of sagebrush. The next picture down you can see is the Lawson aerator, and you can see it just has this crushing effect, leaves some sagebrush still alive, but does reduce the canopy. And in the very bottom, you can see the effects of spike. And what was really interesting with our spike was that the depth of the soil mattered, so that where you had shallower soils, the rate of kill on your sagebrush went up quite a bit. So this area in the picture where you see all the gray sagebrush, those are a little bit shallower soils. But when we got in the deeper soils, then we didn't have as much of an effect. And what this created was kind of a feathering effect across the landscape of treatment, and a gradation within these areas of defoliated versus partially defoliated versus like completely intact. And well, I'll come back to that because that's important. This first one though is shrub cover. So on the top left is just what happened in the controls with shrub cover, which is basically sagebrush canopy cover. And then I kept the control data going so you could see how the different treatments related. So Dixie Harrow, we had an effect. Lawson area, we had an effect. And the Tebethyron, we had an effect, and you can see it's below the control. We don't see the dip because of that year gap that we had with treatment. But at any rate, our treatments work. This is kind of a duh slide, looking at this data, if you kill sagebrush, it will reduce canopy. So here's the where it gets interesting, and this is our grass response. So the treatments were done in 2000 and 2001, and you can see our controls and what happened to grass over time in the controls. In our Dixie Harrow, the blue line is our average, the red lines are our 95% confidence intervals. So in Dixie, we had a grass response right at first after treatment, and then that response kind of went away. In our loss narrator, it took a year or two, and then we had a grass response, and then it kind of went away. In our spiked areas, it was really interesting. We didn't see much of a response for a few years, and then over time, though, it really started to separate from the control. And this gets even more interesting when we look at the forb response. So here's our forb response in the control. Here's it is in the Dixie and Lawson. We basically got very little treatment effect in the mechanicals. However, in the tebethyron, we had a strong forb response, and it pretty much is separating itself from the controls and going higher. And that's really quite interesting. What we did, and Nate put quite a bit of time into this, and credit to him, but we took our data and we separated out all the forbs that we knew grouse ate. So we went back to the literature, pulled out all the forbs that were reportedly eaten by grouse, and then we regraphed this just based on what we're calling grouse forbs. And you can see a slight increase in the Dixie, not much in the Lawson, but the spiked areas, we got a full separation of these more succulent forbs that are often eaten by grouse. I'll just tell you right now, a lot of this was dandelion and false dandelion there in the spikes. And so what's happening here is you have these skeletons of sagebrush that still have roots in place. They still have these skeletons out. They're catching the snow, and they're creating a microenvironment of higher precip, but those plants aren't there to suck that moisture out. So it's creating a more moisture-rich area, these little microclimates, and that we saw this succulent forb response going on. That was really kind of cool, and it helped explain how the grouse responded. So when we look at over time at the pellets, so this is pellet counts per treatment type, you can see that our pellets in our spikes were twice as high as everything else. When we looked at the dog data, this is proportions of grouse, total grouse flushed, and you can see in our spiked areas, the grouse were just highly selecting our spiked areas. And I'll just tell you, the broods were thick in our spiked areas. They were really using, and so based on sage-grouse biology, they were really getting after those insects that were associated with the higher forb content there. One interesting thing that came out of the pellet work was I kept track of where we found pellets and the distance to treatment edge. And that's distance whether we were in a treatment or whether we were in an intact sagebrush stand. And what we found was that once you got about 30 meters out from the edge of that intact sagebrush, or if you're in intact sagebrush from the treatment, that the pellet densities went way down. So what that tells us is the grouse they wanted that treatment area and the effect, but they didn't want to be too far away from that intact sagebrush cover. And so that kind of gives us a hint at how we might prescribe sagebrush treatments in the future if grouse are a concern. So that was a real interesting finding. So moving into those higher elevation pastures and the forage or biomass response that we found, and this is stuff from Eric and Nate's data. The South pasture was our oldest treatment in 2006, and Chicken Springs was our most recent treatment in 2012. This data was taken in 2015. And you can see the orange are the forbs and the green is the grass. And in the South, we got a little bit of a response, but as we moved into the Nicks, Buttes, and Forshey, and especially in Chicken Springs, we got quite a forb and grass response. The stars indicate statistical significance, but basically the spike treatment is working and it's increasing forage, both of grasses and forbs is what we're seeing here. When we ran dogs in 2014 and 15, this is what we found, that we had a little bit of variation based on pasture, and I think that's just a timing thing of when grouse are there and when they're not. But the bigger picture is looking at just at the reference and how many grouse per kilometer were flushed in the reference areas versus grouse per kilometer in the treated areas. And our treated areas just had by far more grouse using those areas. So that was really interesting. That the grouse are kind of telling us what they want here. So I'm going to leave the Parker and I'm going to transition to the Deseret land and livestock here. I don't know if you're familiar with the ranch. I'll assume you're not, but it's a huge 200 and something thousand acre, primarily private ranch up there on basically just a little bit south and east of us up against Wyoming. They have some high elevation areas with forests and a little bit of sage, mountain sage, and then they have most of the eastern half of the ranch is basin big sage or down into Wyoming big sage. And you can see a little bit of the BLM inholdings that are included on the ranch. Elevation again is moving up from east to west here. What we wanted to do was, I was working with Rick Danver, who was the wildlife manager up there, and he was seeing some things from the sage-grouse population, some good things that were happening, and they were doing some pretty intensive range management and sagebrush reduction. And so we wanted to look at how can we look at this landscape and compare it to other landscapes. So kind of staying at this much broader scale. Well, as we're all aware, it's really hard to replicate at huge scales. And so this isn't replicated, it's just a comparison. So what we did was we looked at this landscape. Deseret land livestock is the outline in dark gray there. All of those black squares are sage-grouse leks on the ranch. The dark circles are sage-grouse leks on BLM, primarily BLM lands north of the ranch on the Utah side. All the triangles are sage-grouse leks in Wyoming that have very similar systems as what's going on DLL as far as their sagebrush goes. And so we had data for all of these leks, and so we said, okay, let's look at Lek counts and what are the differences. We also had brood counts on the Utah side in the BLM, and we had brood counts on the ranch. And then lastly, we had some information, some dog surveys on sage-grouse use of treatment areas on the ranch. So the basic approach was DLL had some high intensity, low duration grazing going on with about 30% of their pasture areas rested each year. Rich County primarily had season-long grazing or very simple rotation grazing, same with the Wyoming area. So stocking rates were actually, DLL had about 2 times the stocking rate as the BLM lands in northern Rich County for the Wyoming area. As far as sagebrush treatment or loss of sagebrush over time, DLL was treating about 1.5% per year. So of that sage-grouse habitat area, from 1989 to 2013, about 15% of that sagebrush had been treated. In Rich County, less than 2% was treated. They weren't doing much management at the time. And then in Wyoming, about 8% of that area got treated. But what that really was a really big wildfire, not the same kind of management going on at DLL. So that's kind of the setup for how we're looking at these 3 different populations or population areas, we'll call them. So here's the Lek count. So DLL is in red, Rich County's in green, and Wyoming's in blue. So this is males per lek, so this is a density of birds estimate. So as you can see, we're coming out of the mid-80s. All 3 populations are tracking together. DLL has now, by this time, switched over to their high intensity, low duration grazing. And then in the mid 90s, we see this big separation between densities of males at Lex on DLL compared to the other two areas. And it almost doubled if you look at the combination between Rich and Wyoming, the density of males. And it stayed that way for almost 15 years. And then they all crashed together at the same time. And what happened is in 2010 and 2011, we had some major winter weather come in the late winter and early spring. And no matter how good you're doing, the weather can come and trump the whole thing. And the graph on the right is just a point change analysis, which is probability that there was an actual change in the population for DLL. And you can see both inflection points have a high probability that that was an actual change. So you can see that there was obviously some benefit during that period post sagebrush treatments to the grouse, although at some point the weather trumped it, and the bigger you are, the harder you fall. So for brood counts, what we saw on DLL versus BLM, the main story here is that our chicks per brood on DLL were in the 4+ chicks per brood, and on the BLM in the same years were about half of that. So we just had more chicks being produced on the DLL area. So as for sagebrush treatments on DLL, here's what it kind of looks like. As far as size of treatment goes, most of the treatments were under 100 acres, and then just a few were larger. You can see in that graphic down there. And then as far as where they were being put on the landscape, there was a few treatments were below in the lower elevations, but most of the treatments were in the higher elevation, mid either the basin or the mountain. When we looked at how grouse use these treatments, what we found was that grouse were selecting for treated areas more often than untreated areas, but they had the same issue as Parker in that they were not going very far out into these treated areas. They still wanted to be near that intact sagebrush. DLL used fire, they used loss narrator, they used disking, and they used some tebuthioron. So this is a combo look at all that kind of put together. But we definitely saw some positive responses from the grouse. So the take home here is when we're in these higher elevation areas of mountain big sage, or I'll include basin there a little bit, spike has shown the best results, and grouse have selected for that. Also, along with this, spike has shown a good forage response for the livestock. We have this feathered effect, or this partial kill, which is the sage grouse really like this because it creates this mosaic that they're never too far from cover in those kind of areas. And spike creates that microclimate that we talked about to increase forbs, and these areas are preferred by the grouse and the broods. We would recommend mosaic patterns of less than 120 meters wide treatment and leaving at least 50% of the sagebrush intact if you're up in these more brood habitats. Now, if you know you're in nesting habitat or you know you're in wintering habitat, then we really have to change how we look at this. We want to match our spatial and temporal scales with the sagebrush type so that we're not treating too much area and we're not treating too often. We want that recovery to be able to take place so we don't just lose that sagebrush community. Because if we do, then we can't go anywhere else. We did find this forage increase in these higher elevation brood habitat areas for cattle, and and sheep. We had sheep in those areas too. And in the deeper soils, there's a little more bang for your buck when it comes to treatment. I think it's important to note that the adaptive management process is very important. that we're learning as we go and adapting to the local conditions. And especially from the DLL work, you know, there's this balance between nutritional effects and the structural or the habitat. And we have wildlife need both. Livestock definitely need the nutritional stuff. So we have to think about that balance between the two. And again, pointing us back to late broodering habitat for sage-grouse is where we have the potential to have positive impact on the grouse. What's really interesting about the DLL study and a little bit with the Parker study is that there's very few published cases of increasing sage-grouse populations. But in both those cases, as treatments were taking place, we had increasing sage-grouse populations. So this idea that these are sagebrush obligates, we can't touch the sagebrush, and that's going to preserve them forever, I think that's just a little too simplistic, and there's a lot more complexity and nuance for managing those types of situations. I think, well, I'll try to go through this fairly quickly, but this is really important. When we look at what we know about sage-grouse right now, and we're considering treatment, the biggest issue is how much of that landscape that you're considering has sagebrush that dominates it. And so I'm going to call it the 1/4, 1/2, 2/3 rule. And what I mean by that is, let's say this is your landscape, this circle, and you have a lek in the middle of it. The buffer there is anywhere from, based on the research, it's anywhere from 18 to 30 kilometers, basically. So it's a big landscape, okay? If only 25% or less of that landscape is dominated by sagebrush, your lek is gone. It's no longer persistent. From 25% up to 50%, you have this sliding scale of probability of lek persistence. The closer you get to 50%, the higher the probability. The closer to 25%, the lower probability of persistence. Between 50% and 66%, you have a really high probability of lek persistence. And if it's over 66%, your probability is basically 1.0 or 100% chance that lek is going to persist in the future. When I talked about what's the most important thing to understand about sage-grouse is the scale at which they need to persist, this really puts it into perspective. So when we're going to these areas and treating, we need to understand how much of that area is dominated by sagebrush. If we're over 50%, then hey, let's talk. Let's figure out a way to move forward. Can we benefit livestock at the same time benefiting sage-grouse? Can we consider some different options for restoration? We have a lot more wiggle room, especially over 66%, over 2/3. We have a lot of wiggle room to talk about manipulation of sagebrush. But if we're left less than 50% of that overall area being dominated by sagebrush, then we have some issues to confront with how to move forward with the sagebrush treatment project. Okay, so I think this is one of the more critical things to understand from what we know about sage-grouse and how we look at treatments is we start at this level. Then we have the R&R values, and these are available at the Sage-Grouse Initiative website. You can download spatial data across the West to look at categories of R&R values. So I'm just going to go through a quick example. Here's a proposed treatment area. So the first thing we ask, is it in a sage-grouse priority area? What is the seasonal habitat types? So these define, you know, whether you're nesting or winter or brooding. And then what's the R&R values? So the green would be the highest R&R values. Yellow would be kind of mid-grade R&R values. So that would be another indicator in how things go. Here's an example of looking at a 30-kilometer radius around the nearest lek to that project area. And when we looked at the sagebrush cover there, we're dealing with only about 40% of that area has sagebrush, which is really interesting because that lek has basically blinked out, or there might be 1 or 2 males on it, compared to other leks in the area that are highly persistent when we deal with higher. So it follows the pattern. And so we can look at these landscapes with these values and start to predict how we might move forward or resist moving forward with sagebrush canopy removal projects. I'm going to skip through this. This is kind of a flow chart on how to look at sagebrush treatments. I can share this later if needed, but it's using the same principles as I just shared. The one thing before I end, I wanted to talk about, there's some exceptions, and that's when we're dealing with this situation. So this is a Wyoming sagebrush community or stand in West Box Elder, and it has an almost complete understory of cheatgrass. So technically, this is still sage-grouse habitat, and it's winter habitat. Sage-grouse only need sagebrush above the snow in the winter, and this would provide that. However, this area also has a high probability of being lost to wildfire. One little lightning strike or flick of a cigarette out the window, and this whole thing's gone. So in these situations, we need to think about and come up with ways, how do we restore that? How do we get perennial grass back into that system to compete against the cheatgrass? Otherwise, this system is doomed. And although it could be sage-grouse habitat in 5 years, the probability of it being sage-grouse habitat in 20 years is really low. So, but we need more research on this. There's just not much out there on how we deal with this situation. But in my mind, this is an exception to some of the rules that I just talked about as far as area to treat and what R&R values are going on and that kind of thing. I'll end with just thinking we've had many partners on all this research and all the work we've done with this, and here's a list of them. So I'm grateful to them and Terry and Eric who worked on this with me.